Welcome everyone to NERI's April webinar. My name is Cordelia Anderson and I'm guest host for today, and I want to welcome you all to What's Wrong with This Picture, an overview of the impact of men's viewing pornography. It's going to be presented by Ervin Funk. But before we get to Russ, I have a few moments to tell you about NERI Press. NERI's mission is to share cutting-edge research and best practices emerging in our field. For many years, they've accomplished that mission only through book sales. With all the changes in the last several years around publishing and technology worlds, they've been compelled to continue their mission by expanding how they disseminate knowledge in new ways. It's really important to NERI Press and Training Center to hear from all of you about what kinds of information, training, resources, and books you want and you need in order to be the best professional possible. So please contact them with your suggestions and your feedback, whether that's positive or negative. They just need to know more about what you're thinking. So just out of curiosity, how many people have participated in NERI Press webinars before? Jonathan's going to be launching a poll. So it looks like we have a lot of you who are returning to these, which is great, and 31% who are new to the webinars. That's a good mix of people that have had the benefit of these before and who are new. Now, every webinar has its learning objectives, and for Russ's, it's to recognize the relationship of men's pornography use to other forms of gender-based violence. Also, to identify 2 activities that you can use to help men explore the impact of viewing pornography. Also, so that you have more confidence to address pornography in your efforts to respond to or prevent gender-based violence. I also want to let you know that there's a YouTube recording of this webinar that's going to be posted on the NERI Press website within a week. The slides are currently ready for you to download from the NERI Press webinars page at neripress.org/webinars. Meanwhile, as Jonathan mentioned, you can download the slides right now from your control panel on the right-hand side. That's also where you can ask questions of Russ throughout this webinar, and we'll bring those into the discussion at the end. When the workshop is over, be sure to answer the short survey at the end. We would really like your feedback. And finally, in about a week, you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to the recordings and a certificate of attendance that you can download. So, as someone who has focused on child sexual abuse and prevention my whole career and done a lot on the impact of pornography on children, youth, and culture, which I'm honored to have NERI also have as a booklet, I am particularly honored to introduce our today's speaker, Ervin Funk, in part, not only because I'm passionate about this topic, but I have tracked his career and respected the work that he has done for years, and I'm very excited to have us all hear more about this. As a therapist, Russ has worked for more than 10 years with men who batter and with adolescents and adults who sexually offend. Russ is currently a consultant and activist who focuses on preventing gender-based violence. Russ created the What's Wrong with This Picture initiative in 2017 and wrote the curriculum in 2018. So this is exciting new resources for all of you. Russ sits on the board of the Global Men Engage Alliance, Secretary of the National Center on Sexual and Domestic Violence, and serves on the steering committee of the North American Men Engage Network. I am delighted to be able to have this opportunity to hear you, Russ, and for you to be able to share your great new resources with everyone. Thank you.
Good afternoon, at least from the East Coast. Welcome to this webinar. I appreciate you all showing up and participating in this. And I am very excited to share with you what we come up with in terms of what's wrong with this picture. Give me a minute to turn this around so that you can view my screen and see the slideshow that I have available for this. And also, as both Cordelia and Jonathan have said, you have access to these slides. So I hope you'll take advantage of that. So as Cordelia said, What's Wrong with This Picture is a program that has a number of moving pieces. The core is the curriculum that I'll be talking about in a few moments, but there's also an educational booklet that looks at the overall, the impact of men's viewing of pornography. And on the website, there are additional resources and materials that are already up and more that I'm developing around the issue of how do we support men and encourage men to examine the impact of viewing pornography. More and more of these are coming online almost on a weekly basis. A lot right now I am focusing on are resources to help you integrate some of this content into some of the work that you're doing, either as therapists and treatment providers or as preventionists. Just as a back note or reinforcer, these resources are designed on the prevention side. I think that there's value for those of you who are treatment providers and tools that you can use in terms of doing therapy or intervention with men, both men who sexually offend, men who batter, and men in general. But the content and the resources are designed from a preventionist perspective and a preventionist frame. More information is available at my website, specifically the page www.tp. Yep, that's me being creative. What's wrong with this picture? There you go. All right, so one of the things that is the foundation for this work, this project, is looking kind of a media literacy participation. So if we look at pornography as a form of media, and recognizing that all media transmits certain values at the same time that that is transmitting the storyline of whatever that media is. And like with all media, sometimes we're not necessarily paying attention to the values that we're consuming at the same time they're watching media. Now, one of the things that we've noticed in running What's Wrong with This Picture here in Louisville over the last several years is that men tend not to pay attention to the values that are inherent in the pornography that they're watching. They're watching and consuming the storyline, if you will, but not necessarily paying attention to the values that are embedded in pornography. And one of the things that we've learned early on, and we are consistently learning as we run this program, is that there is often a disconnect for the men who participate in the program between the values that they claim to believe and the values that are inherent in pornography. And so one of the first opportunities that emerge rather quickly in the curriculum is having them attend to the fact that there is this disconnect. There is this disagreement that they experience between the values that they say they hold and the values that are inherent in pornography. That cognitive dissonance is exactly one of the things that we're trying to expose by encouraging men to take a look at the impact of viewing in pornography. Some of the programs that we have help men figure out how do they deal with that cognitive dissonance. But the first step is creating a space where men can notice that there is, in fact, this disconnect. And that disconnect results in some discomfort. That discomfort is where we can drive a bus through in terms of encouraging the behavior change that we're seeking to change. So real quickly, some of what we know from research in terms of an overview of the impact of men viewing pornography, as this quote indicates, pornography does not tend to depict visions of affection, relationship, expressions of love, or foreplay or afterplay. Those are all missing from any kind of pornographic imagery. And that lack is problematic. As you all know, healthy sexuality, healthy sexual expression, healthy sexual intimacy between partners includes all of these. And if that's lacking in what men are viewing in the pornography, it tends to come out in how they interact with other people. So some of the values of pornography that get depicted are a very particular form of masculinity, defined and positioned as polar opposite to that is feminine. The masculinity of pornography is often hyper-masculinized and hyper-sexualized, and positions men to be in the dominant or in charge position. one of the messages of pornography is that any man can please any and all women, and that is in fact a role that he has in terms of his sexuality and his sexual role. There's also an element of men's entitlement and access to women's bodies that is pronounced in pornography. If you look kind of on a macro of pornography as a whole, one of the storylines that emerges is that all men can please any woman, and all men have access to any woman's body. This is particularly true. One of the racist elements that is inherent in all heterosexual pornography is the degree to which white men are entitled to the bodies of African American, Latina, Asian, and Native women or men. This crosses the line of heterosexual and gay pornography. This sense of entitlement to white men's entitlement to other people's bodies, to do with them as they please. And this entitlement of the other includes other expressions and other forms of violence and abuse that is not necessarily inherent to the way that white men's entitlement to white women's bodies is depicted in pornography. Some of the research has demonstrated that after viewing pornography, men have decreased empathy for rape victims. This is research that has been followed up on, and the same results tend to emerge, that watching pornography on a relatively frequent basis decreases men's empathy for rape victims. It also tends to enhance men's belief that women who dress provocatively, whatever that may mean, deserve to be raped, that they are that women are asking for it in particular ways. Now, again, this is a narrative that is common in our culture already, as the American Psychological Association has identified, among others, but it gets exemplified, it gets exaggerated in pornography. Viewing pornography also tends to increase men's anger at women who flirt with them, but then refuse to have sex. So again, kind of fueling the sense of entitlement. There's already existing a sense for men that women who flirt with us, we are entitled to have sexual relations with them. This appears to be magnified and exaggerated for men who view pornography on a regular. Men who view pornography on a regular basis report increased interest in coercing partners into unwanted sex acts. One of the narratives of pornography that is almost universal seems to be this notion that women who don't really know what they want sexually, and that it is the male partner that is able to convince them to engage in things that they initially don't want to do. And then women, part of the narrative of pornography is that women find that they are in fact satisfied, and they do in fact want and desire the very thing that initially they did not want or desire. Viewing pornography tends to increase men's aggression towards women and increase their willingness to accept and tolerate men's aggression towards women. So this is kind of a double-edged impact of viewing pornography. And this is particularly alarming to me as a preventionist, that men's viewing pornography decreases men's willingness and intentionality to become active in efforts to respond to or prevent gender-based violence in their communities, on their campuses, in their environments. This is largely related to bystander intervention and bystander participation, but viewing pornography on a regular basis is a disincentive for men's participation in bystander efforts on the college campus or at the community level. Now, one of the things that I think doesn't get discussed near enough in terms of the impact of viewing pornography is the ways that viewing pornography and the practices that men engage in while they're viewing pornography, the ways that magnifies the impact. So on the previous slide, I kind of outlined what the impact is. What we know is that masturbating to those images, to those lessons, to those values, drives the lesson and attaches the lessons and those values to the pleasure points in the brain. And masturbating to orgasm is one of the most pleasurable experiences that we have as human beings. And so if you drive those values and those lessons to the pleasure points, the impact gets magnified in almost immeasurable ways. into the brain centers of the person who's viewing the pornography, who is integrating the values. In addition, men's viewing habits tend to be collective in nature. And by that I mean they don't necessarily, particularly anymore with the internet, they don't necessarily sit around the couch looking at pornographic magazines. However, because the norm of men's viewing pornography is so pronounced and so accepted, men's experience of viewing tends to be in this in this context of it being a collective process, a collective experience. Furthermore, there are websites and web communities of men who view pornography and then they share their experiences of viewing pornography. And again, that fact that it is a collective experience magnifies the impact of viewing it. It magnifies the social norm effect of the values that men are consuming at the same time that they're consuming pornography. Now, obviously, this is not on a conscious basis. Men aren't consciously aware of the fact that being in a collective where the social norm is accepting of the values of pornography reinforces the values of pornography. As I stated earlier, men aren't very often aware of the values that are inherent in pornography and what they're consuming. But the fact that it's part of the dynamic, the fact that it's part of the context is part of what magnifies the experience and magnifies the degree to which the impact, the values get integrated into men and men's experience. So part of what kind of relates to this notion of that there is a community of porn users is some of the research by Franklin, Bruford, and Pratt that men in male peer groups view pornography more than other men. So men in fraternities, men who exist in a fraternity, in some kind of fraternal group, have a higher rate of pornography use. There is research that I've seen on a fairly regular basis, including recently, where men in the Bible Belt area actually have a higher rate of pornography viewing than men in other parts of the country. There's this sense of male peer group within churches and synagogues and mosques. I should say in some churches, synagogues, and mosques, and some faith communities, where men's experience in those faith communities is very much of a fraternal experience. And just like in fraternities, that fraternal experience appears to drive men's pornography use. Walter de Kesselry and Martin Schwartz, back in 2013, developed this notion of male peer support and the ways that the perceived support that men have around their male peer support network, around the values and the norms, reinforces their values and their attitudes that relate to those norms. So since most men who view pornography assume that their male peer support network also watches pornography and also watches the same kinds of pornography that they do, it reinforces the influence of that pornography watching. And then the community of porn use that men tend to have as they watch pornography flatlines, if you will, the variance of men's perceptions of pornography. I'll get into this in more detail later, assuming I have time, but what I refer to there is that men tend to assume that other men view pornography and view this in the same ways that they do and view the same kinds of pornography that they do. There is, in fact, a wide variety of ways that men view pornography and a wide variety of the pornography that men use. But the fact that men aren't aware of these differences means that men's assumptions going in is that the other men are viewing the same kind of pornography that I am, therefore reinforcing the sense of a social norm that, so what I'm doing is acceptable or normal. Another way that this gets played out is that men can identify other men who view more harmful forms of pornography, therefore normalizing and acceptabilizing, sanitizing, if you will, the kind of pornography that they watch. Now, there's research that's demonstrated this. I also have this flatlining dynamic. I also, in the iterations as we developed what's wrong with this picture in the curriculum, that notion of flatlining has emerged almost every time when we've run the program and run the curriculum. So for the next 15 minutes or so, I want to take a few minutes to kind of provide you with an overview of the curriculum itself. So the curriculum is based on 8 sessions. They are designed as 90-minute sessions facilitated conversations. They are activity heavy. There is at least 2 activities in every 90-minute workshop. The activities last anywhere from 10 minutes to half an hour. There's one activity that's an overnight activity or overweek activity that I'll be sure and touch on, because I think it's one that you all can take with you in your efforts. It's a fairly easy activity and has multiple learning lessons for men. As I said earlier, it takes a media literacy approach, and the 2 goals are the 2 primary goals are develop men's critical awareness of the impact of viewing pornography and increase men's compassion for women's experience of men's pornography use. Now, one might hope that one of the goals would be to decrease men's experiences of viewing pornography or interest and willingness to view pornography. Frankly, that seems a little bit optimistic for an 8-session curriculum. So we focus on the 2 goals that I've identified here. What's wrong with this picture? The curriculum that we published last year with NERI, thank you very much, by the way, to NERI Press, began around 2015 as a project of what was then Men's Work Eliminating Violence Against Women. Men's Work was a community-based organization here in Louisville that focused on engaging and mobilizing men as allies in working to end gender-based violence and promote gender equality. What's wrong with this picture emerged as one of the programs and projects of Men's Work. It emerged using emergent curriculum design. And for those of you who aren't aware of emergent curriculum design, rather than me crafting this curriculum looking out my lovely window in the highlands of Louisville, Kentucky, this curriculum was based using an iterative process of designing the outline, designing some of the activities, and then as we engaged men in the curriculum, we involved their whole selves. So we invited them to participate not just as participants, but also from Jump Street as designers of the curriculum. So even as they were going through the curriculum themselves and participating, they were also giving us feedback about activities, about lessons learned, about curriculum modifications. This was very much a collectively written process. As I say in the curriculum itself, if I had the ability to remember their names and write down all of the names of the men who participated in the various iterations between 2015 and 2017, this would be the authors were numerous. And then we also engaged in critical feedback from other sources. So as we developed various iterations of this curriculum, we sent it out to pornography survivors. We sent it out to other survivors of other forms of sexual exploitation, sexual assault, sexual violence. We sent it out to feminist advocates in order to get their critical feedback on what we were developing and making sure that this content and the process was as accountable as possible to the people who are harmed by pornography and to the impact that this has on them. Technical glitch for a minute. One of the things that I use almost universally in my work with engaging men to promote gender equality is this notion of the learning engagement opportunities. And one of the things that we learn from that is that for adult learning, for child learners, for engagement opportunities in general, that we need to move people out of the comfort zone. People don't tend to learn well if they're comfortable. They need a little bit of discomfort. They need a little bit of tension in order to learn effectively. People don't tend to move and become engaged in efforts towards social change if they stay comfortable. Our job is to encourage folks to stay in this discomfort region. As a baby therapist, one of the first lessons I learned was my tendency as a baby therapist was to help folks feel comfortable as quickly as possible. And it's of no surprise to most of you is that what ended up happening was that people started dropping out of therapy because, frankly, who goes to therapy if they feel comfortable? It took me some while to learn that it wasn't my job to make people feel comfortable. It was my job to create a space where they could feel confident in their discomfort to be able to stay in the discomfort. So I apply this to our work, both in terms of engaging men in gender-based violence and in particular this work of engaging men around critical conversations of pornography. The challenge that we have is that we are actually starting for most men in the red zone. The conversations around pornography, critical conversations in particular about pornography, conversations addressing sexual exploitation, tend to immediately push men, most human beings actually, into this red zone. These are disgusting, awful, atrocious topics for most people. Examining the harm that is done by sexual exploitation and sexual assault is really disgusting for most human beings. And so our job needs to be, how do we pull them back into that discomfort zone, as opposed to move them from comfort to discomfort. And that's a lot of what's embedded in the work of the curriculum. One of the things that emerged from our work around pornography use and around what's wrong with this picture is this notion of men's attitudes about pornography use being on this continuum. For those of you who know my work, you may recognize this as somewhat related to the continuum of male engagement that I created 20-something years ago. But the notion is that men's attitudes on pornography and viewing pornography are not static. They're actually very nuanced. And that nuance provides opportunities for us to explore and expose the dissonance that I talked about earlier, and then creates an opportunity to engage in a rich dialogue. Men also have very varied perspectives about pornography and viewing pornography, and they don't talk about these varied perspectives and attitudes. That lack of talking about it reinforces the social norm about the acceptability of men's use. And the fact, what we found in running this program, running the curriculum, is that giving men an opportunity to talk with each other about the fact that these varied perspectives and attitudes exist amongst peer groups is the most valuable opportunity in terms of changing and shifting men's attitudes and experiences of viewing pornography. So a quick overview of the outline. The first session is the welcome and an overview. Then we talk about what's the impact. We explore who the women are in pornography. We look at pornography, gender roles, and flirting, and the impact in particular of men's viewing pornography and their flirting behaviors. We explore the impact further in session 5. Session 6 focuses on racism in pornography. And the last 2 sessions focus on men's role and men's opportunities to engage in prevention efforts. Session 7 focuses on them as individual allies and what they can do on the individual level. And session 8 focuses on men as a collective. The ideal being that men who are part of this peer group that is either already in existence when we start the program, or that emerges from spending time the last 7 weeks on this, in this effort, they become a peer group that might be able to form as a collective to engage in prevention work around gender-based violence more broadly. So the welcome and the overview session focuses primarily on developing a sense of connection and community amongst the participants. What we have found in the years that we've been running various versions of what's wrong with this picture is that there is much more success, much more quick success, if this is implemented with a group that already exists, than if trying to create a group of men who don't know each other. Most of the time in Louisville, when we've been running this, we've been able to run it by partnering with organizations that already have an existing men's group. And so we just kind of hijack that men's group for 8 weeks. We had less success in a kind of a general call of inviting men to participate in this conversation. And then the first goal is primarily to explore that initial experience of pornography. The first workshop that we do is we invite men to recall their introduction to pornography, their first experiences of viewing pornography. And what we have found very, very consistently is that men's initial experience was often very conflicted. There were parts of them that obviously liked and enjoyed the fact that they were watching pornography, but there were also parts of their experience that was scary, anxiety producing, nervous. They felt judged. They felt extremely uncomfortable. I shouldn't say extremely, they felt varying degrees of discomfort. Again, the fact that men don't have an opportunity to talk about the fact that they did have these conflicting experiences of their first experience of viewing pornography means that they silence the discomfortable experiences and promote, or what's the word for bravado-ize? Let me make that word up. The positive effects of pornography. What we know about brain science is that those dual experiences still exist within them, and every time they view pornography, then those same experiences, because they haven't been discussed and unpacked, those same experiences get reinforced and reinforced and reinforced. So that for most men, in fact, at least from our experience with running this program, there is a long-standing history of mixed feelings and conflicting experiences about their experience of viewing pornography. The next session looks at what's the impact. And we go deeper into exposing men's ambivalence of viewing pornography and begin exploring men's different attitudes about viewing pornography. The take a position activity is a situation where we draw, some of you know about this activity, you draw an imaginary continuum on the floor and ask men to take a position to the degree to which they agree or disagree to certain statements about men's pornography use. Now, the way that I tend to run it does not allow men to take a neutral position. They have to take a position to varying degrees of agree or to disagree. I know some versions of this activity of take a position allows a neutral stance. I don't know how that's helpful in this conversation to allow men to take a neutral stance. The third activity is looking at the women who are in pornography, and the main goals of this session are to begin increasing men's compassion for women in pornography, examine some of the key lessons within pornography and some of the key values that pornography magnifies, and examine and identify behaviors associated with men who view pornography. The continuum of harm activity actually comes from work with men who batter, and what we do is we identify a host of pornography viewing behaviors and related behaviors and ask men, both individually and in small groups within the class, to put those behaviors on a continuum of least to most harmful. You will note that one of the options is not that this behavior is not harmful. My perspective and the perspective of the continuum is that all viewing of pornography is harmful. It hurts people. And so it is a question of least to most, not harmful to most. The next session is looks at pornography, gender roles, and flirting. Here we expose the notion of a pornographer's gaze, which we talk about as the gaze that, as someone who is viewing pornography, you are drawn in through the camera, you are drawn in through the quote-unquote narrative of pornography videos to have a certain gaze as the way that you look at the woman who's also in pornography, or the women, and the sex itself. That gaze is one that men tend to take, who view pornography, tend to take with them out of their experience of viewing pornography and out into the world. We also, and during the session, begin to look at the norms that are in pornography and how they may conflict or contradict with the values that men say that they hold, and then continue to increase men's compassion for women's experience of the pornography's gaze. The activities that are part of this session are the porn world versus real world activity, which I don't have time to go into at this point, but the activity of experience a mile in her shoes, sort of. This is actually an activity that I created many years ago for adolescent men around the issue of sexual harassment, but we found it very useful in this and what's wrong with this picture curriculum as well. The activity is you invite men to partner with a female friend, ideally not a family member, but someone that they experience as an equal. And then his job is to follow behind her as she walks through a public sphere, a public space. So down a crowded street, through the mall, across campus, any kind of area that is fairly active with other people. His job is to pay attention to how men are watching her, how men look at her, and men's behaviors towards her, his friend. We call it walk a mile in her shoes, sort of, because it is one of the activities that allows men to catch a glimpse at the persistent and pernicious nature of men's street harassment, or hallway harassment, or campus harassment, that it is almost an unending basis, but men don't have an experience of seeing that. So this was the one kind of homework assignment that we have as a part of this curriculum. This is something that men are asked to do between this session and the next one, and then come back to the next session and report out on their experience of walking a mile, if you will, in her shoes. In the next session, part of the unpacking is that we spend some time talking with men about what was their experience and how does their experience of following their friend and paying attention to the way to which she is being harassed and the persistent nature of harassment. How is that reinforced? How is that behavior of men harassing women, of men viewing women in that way? How is that reinforced by their viewing of pornography? What we are looking at is an opportunity for men to develop some compassion around the pornography gaze and how pornography gaze fuels street harassment and other forms of harassment and abuse. The other main goal of exploring the impact this session is assessing the impact of viewing pornography on men. And this is where we start to turn the lens back on men themselves, and how does viewing pornography impact on men's ideas of masculinity, men's views of themselves as men. The research suggests that men who view pornography on a regular basis tend to have lower self-esteem and lower self-confidence about their own body image, about their own sense of self as a man. Because we as men, I think it's obvious, don't necessarily live up to the narrative and the image that is depicted in pornography about what a man is, what a man should be, and how a man behaves sexually. This is one lesson so this is a lesson where we kind of turn that lens back towards men and themselves. The sixth session looks specifically at the issue of racism and pornography and the ways that racism is both a persistent core of the pornography narrative and the ways that it is exposed in specific ways. The goal is obviously to increase men's empathy and compassion for women of color. The activity is assessing the impact of racism. It involves viewing a snippet of a video and then discussing that snippet. This is the one session that only has one activity. The next session, session 7, begins the exploration of men becoming an ally. We explore the notion of a bystander and what it means to be a bystander, and we also then explore what it means to be an ally or allying. The main activity is shifting from bystander to ally, where men explore the opportunities that they have to be an ally, what the invitations they've had in the past to ally with women and girls, what are the reasons that they at those moments said no and were comfortable and willing to step back and be a bystander, and what would have supported them to take an ally role. And then the last session is being part of the solution. And this involves exploring the ways that men can take collective action to end gender-based violence and promote gender equality, and create connections amongst the men in the room to facilitate the men's further collective activism. The activity is called Working for Change, and it involves examining the social ecology and the social ecology framework by looking at what are the ways that men can impact on the social norms at the various levels of the social ecology. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, this is the ecological framework, the social ecology that I referred to a moment ago. And the basic notion of the social ecology is that our interpersonal attitudes and behaviors are influenced by our own knowledge and beliefs, but are equally impacted on by other values across the social ecology. So our relationship with others, our relationships with friends, the organizations that we are a part of, the community and the social norms that we live in, and the broader social cultural contexts. So part of the last session, in terms of Working for Change, identifies what are the ways that men can impact at each of these 5 layers of the social ecology. So some of the evidence that we have gleaned from running What's Wrong with This Picture is that after participating in the program, men report higher levels of discomfort in their own pornography use. They report decreased willingness to engage in other forms of commercial sexual exploitation, and report an increased willingness to engage in prevention activism. Now, the next steps of this program, of this model, is to continue to develop additional resources and materials. Right now, I am focusing on materials for college and university campuses and ways that the campuses can either import this program into their Title IX efforts and into their campus prevention efforts, I'm also working on developing treatment materials. As I indicated, this is not a treatment curriculum. This is a prevention curriculum. I think treatment providers can find lots of good use of the material in here to use in their treatment modalities. And I feel some responsibility to start developing additional treatment materials to help ease that process. I'm also in the process of developing some integration resources, which will help develop folks' ability to integrate some of this content and some of this material into their work around gender-based violence, around gender equality, around sex and sexuality education. And I'm working on developing some versions of this that are particularly relevant to the adolescent male population. Right now, what's wrong with this picture is the only curriculum of this kind in the United States. I'm not aware of any other curriculum elsewhere in the globe, but certainly in the United States, it's the only one of its kind. And there's the list of references. So I think I'm about on time to move to the Q&A period. And so I'm going to bump it back to Jonathan and Cordelia to help kind of facilitate the Q&A period. And I look forward to some conversation with you all in the next 15 minutes or so. Hello, Cordelia. Oh, Cordelia, I can't hear you.
I am now unmuted, so
there you
great
go.
job. That's what those hands were saying. Thanks, everybody, for being here. And one of the questions that came in, you did answer, but I want to go back to it, and that's how do you get men to come into these sessions? And I think if I heard you right, you said you partner with a lot of different agencies, but people were really curious. So how do you get guys to attend this? And do you want to say anything more about that?
Yeah, I would just re-emphasize that they're partnering with organizations that already have groups of men who already are working with them, and then allowing you to, or allowing us to hijack their group for 8 weeks. That's been the most effective way. Like with a lot of this content, men aren't necessarily lining up to come to an opportunity to critically examine their view of their experience of viewing pornography, any more than men necessarily lining up to come to a conversation about preventing sexual assault. So looking at ways that we can partner in order to provide this to men who, what we find, are actually open to the conversation, but just, again, because of some of the barriers that we experience because of social norming, don't know that they're open.
Now, you also started to answer this other part, which is a lot of the people on this webinar are clinicians that work with men who have already committed sex offenses. And you talked about some of the upcoming materials, but do you have more ideas or want to say anything more about how you see this as being really useful or linked to these populations or adaptations that would be needed?
Well, it's been a minute since I've been a therapist, so I am currently working with some current treatment providers to help develop some of those modifications and resources. I would say that I think most of the activities here, and at least the feedback I've gotten from some of the providers that I've been talking with, indicate that most of the activities and exercises in here have a therapeutic aspect. I was a therapist for a very long time. I'm a third-generation social worker, so being a therapist is kind of in my bones. And I was very intentional about, or we were very intentional, I should say, about designing the activities with a therapeutic framework. This is difficult stuff. This is really challenging stuff that we're asking men to do. And so while I don't want to soft soap it, I don't want to soft pedal it. I also don't want, it is not my intention to magnify any men's shame or men's negative feelings about this. If those feelings emerge, I think they can be helpful in men's process of change. But I certainly don't want to come in with a shame back with the men who are participating. So I say all that to say, I think that there's a lot of the activities and perspectives that are in the curriculum that can easily be adapted to a therapeutic experience.
I'm curious too. I'm looking to see if I've missed other questions, but while I'm seeing those, one of the things I want to ask you about is that a number of men that I've talked to have said that some of the things that were very helpful for them were, and you mentioned it a couple different times, were learning more about the brain research and being so surprised at what we now have with neuroscience showing the different ways that viewing pornography just affects our brain. The mirror neurons, the neurons that fire together, wire together. The more we watch, the more that shapes that arousal, the literal changes in gray matters, which takes it out of what's an individual issue and looks at what's going on not only the social issues, but the brain issues. And the other one is how the industry lures men in many ways, grooms men in to watch, to consume and watch more. And I wonder if those issues, because you referenced them in a couple different ways, if you wanted to comment further on either of those.
Well, I think likewise, like your experience, the notion that this does impact our brain, and that idea of, what's fired together wires together. That notion I've experienced as well. It tends to have a tremendous impact on the men who participate in the program. The other kind of thing that emerges for me, Cordelia, as you're talking, is how important for me, for this program, to bring in the public health approach, and help men recognize that this is not just about their individual behavior and their individual relations. There is men's pornography use on the collective basis, and the availability of pornography on a collective basis is harmful to women in general, and it is just wildly destructive to the efforts towards gender equality. And so it's kind of both kind of honing in on the micro individualized level of looking at brain science and what this does to you as an individual level, and then also zooming out on more macro level, looking at the fact that this has tremendous impacts on the women that I care about. That the walk a mile in her shoes activity is profoundly impactful for the men who go through it, to notice that it's not just my experience of the pornographer's gaze. How many other men have that gaze and are looking at women in general like that, and how devastating that is on a consistent basis in terms of women's lives. So it's kind of both and zooming in and zooming out, that we find with what's wrong with this picture to have a really tremendous impact.
And has there been anything that you've been particularly surprised with the nature of the conversations that have come up with the different men's groups?
I think what I'm most frequently surprised about is men's willingness and openness once those cracks are exposed, to explore the fact that those cracks exist. Most men who watch pornography are so convinced that their pornography use is either within the norm or outside the norm, in terms of my use is more acceptable than the norm's use, that the fact that they're in a room amongst peers where they disagree with each other around what kinds of pornography use is harmful, what impact is harmful, what related behaviors are harmful. The fact that they stay open to those conversations, they stay open to that self-criticism, that to me it shouldn't be. I've done therapeutic groups long enough to know that that's a normal human experience, but it does continue to be a surprise for me that men stay open to those experiences of being critically, of examining critically their own pornography use.
And NERI has a number of different resources on this, and they're available, but I want to loop back to one of the things that you talked about earlier, and you said I would very clearly that all viewing of pornography is harmful. And for many of the clinicians, many of the people participating in this workshop, they may not have had training about pornography themselves. They may not have had that opportunity. Or in my early training in more the sexuality field, it was, it's great, it's just sex, it's harmless. So I think the field is catching up. It's not just, and you're here presenting this great tool to use with men, but what could you say that might help clinicians and those of us already in the field, but maybe haven't had, particularly with today's pornography, the internet access, the inescapability of that, the early access, but how do we catch up? How do we catch up with what people are seeing and what we have research on in terms of the impact?
How do we catch up in terms of the
clinicians, the clinicians having that information?
I don't know. I think, I hope that doing things like this and magnifying our impact in this way, kind of promoting this workshop, promoting some of your work and your workshops out there into the world as much as we can to help catch up. I think the brain science and the other really clear research on pornography use has demonstrated without a doubt that this is harmful behavior. I think relying more on the public health research that's being done around the public health impact of these kinds of behaviors, I think it may be a way to kind of catch up. And I think in particular, one of the responses that I have around the notion that what's wrong with the pornography, that it really doesn't do any harm, is, you know, let's sidestep for a moment whether or not it does any harm. I clearly have my views, but who benefits? What's the benefit in terms of public health? What's the benefit in terms of human sexuality? What's the benefit in terms of teaching men to value women as real, complex, decent human beings that deserve our valuing? What is the benefit to those methods of viewing pornography? And that tends to generate a response of silence when I ask that question.
That's, I really deeply appreciate that. And we might have time for one or two more questions if you do, but I'm very, very appreciative of that last piece that you say, and because I think there is an issue of benefit, and that this is a major industry. A lot of people don't realize that pornography is a major worldwide industry, and it's a question of who's profiting at whose expense. Mm-hmm. And what's being sold. And I so often hear that oh, I was hoping my dog didn't bark during this. We so often hear that that this is just what men want and what viewers want, increasingly women, as opposed to what's being sold to them. And I don't know how much you get into those discussions.
Not typically in the workshops, in the class. Certainly in my work more broadly around educating around the harms of pornography, doing professional training, certainly that comes up. And I just defer back to the research and what the research has consistently shown us. We have reams and reams of research looking at what the harm is of viewing pornography. And there's no research, there is zero research that suggests that viewing pornography actually increases men's willingness to promote gender equality, valuing of women and girls, enhancing their experience of sex and sexuality, deepening their sense of compassion and connection in terms of sex. There is zero research that supports any of that. And so in the lack of...
I think that's a great summary. And we have to go back to Jonathan, because we could keep chatting and we could keep engaging the audience in this, because there's so much to say, but we do need to move on to a summary. Great job. So I think Jonathan's going to bring up our next slide out of the discussion, because I want to make sure I have the right slides here. Okay, so we really want to invite you to take a look at the final two webinars in this particular series for NERI, which you can view here and can be found at the NERI website, neripress.org, and you can register for both of those webinars now. Also, we want you to know that as an attendee of this webinar, all this information is here. You get a discount on Russ's book, What's Wrong with This Picture? So that's a great offer, and you just need to enter May 130, and all that information is there on your packet. Further, and I know a lot of you are interested in this, NERI offers low-cost continuing education credits, and those will be available for psychologists and social workers for all the webinars that NERI Press does in 2018-2019 season. And for details about how to get your CE credits, just visit neripress.org/webinars, read through their continuing education process, and then if you still have questions after that, you can email Kristen at KLOBISCH, it's all right there, at neri.com. So we also want to let you know about NERI's newsletter. And if you don't get their e-news, I got to tell you that I really use this. I learn things. It helps me. It's hard to keep up with research. It's just a wonderful resource free monthly newsletter in which they discuss a new or controversial journal article or research paper and really examine it. Really helps for what we need to be thinking about and paying attention to. And you're automatically signed up for that resource. So we hope you find it really useful. I find it really useful. And then finally, we want to make sure that all of the sponsors for NERI's 2018-2019 series are recognized. You can see the list of organizational and individual sponsors there, because without them, they would not be able to bring all of this information to you. So thank you. And thank you also to all of you for attending this. Spread the word. People that missed it, that are interested, that again, this will be recorded and you can get that information here. And then also the CE credits. Thank you, Russ, for such a great webinar, and to all of you again for attending. I'm in Minnesota, so we're expecting a blizzard. I don't know how many the rest of you are later this week, but we hope you have a great rest of your week, and thank you for all the work you do. And one final thing, please complete your evaluation form at the close of the webinar.